I'm kidding. I'm going to post this on YouTube, and I just noticed that I got a YouTube subscriber whom I didn't recognize, and I'm going to talk about reading Plato. Since I got a YouTube subscriber that I didn't recognize, and I'm talking about how I learned to read Plato, I'm going to mention from whom I read Plato, which was my grad school professor, Ron Polanski. Now, maybe a little paranoid about this, but I wanted to make sure that I recognize that Ron Polanski is who I learned this from, in case this YouTube subscriber is a spy of his. It may sound a little weird and suspicious, but I was Ron Polanski's spy when I was his graduate assistant, so I know whereof I speak. He asked me, in fact, to find out which of my miscreant colleagues, end quote, had borrowed a book from our university library that he wanted. So it's times like those that it's helpful to know how to compound your own chloroform from household chemicals. But that aside, so here are some tips on reading Plato. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why we're reading Plato when we are, for the honors class who are reading Plato. So we just got done reading Alfred Schutz about the social distribution of knowledge, some of the problems that he mentioned that I think are maybe not the problems, that are also not necessarily the problems, or not the problems in that sense that people talk about when they talk about the problems of information and the spread of information and the information, the use and consumption of information these days. What a lot of people say is a problem, a major problem, even the major problem, is that people don't know the difference between true and false information, that they are not able to distinguish reliable and unreliable sources of information. They don't have a way of knowing what's a good source and a terrible source. They lack what so many people call information literacy. They're not shrewd consumers of information. And relatedly, perhaps, is that people consume information from within usually politically allied silos. So if you're in the political so-called left, you are likely to gain information or seek information only from the so-called political left. If you're in the so-called political right, you're likely to seek and receive information only from the silo, from within the silo of the so-called political right. In any case, this idea of unreliable information, of information that is only corresponding to the biases that people already have, and so forth, this is not a new problem. Not by any means. People have believed according to their in-groups orientation to the world for a long time, for as long as recorded history. And they've believed incredible things, things that are preposterous from our present standpoint, things that seem obvious falsehoods to us now. That's one reason why we should read the Meno after Alfred Schutz, because it deals with questions about believing things, and believing things based on information and where we get information, as you'll see. That's only one thing that it deals with. So on to how to read Plato. I will give you a document that has a short version of this list of tips on reading Plato. So don't worry, don't try to take notes down. I want to give you a kind of general sense of it. First of all, dialogue. Why are they dialogues? Plato was a follower of Socrates. along with his brother Glaucon. Um, the historical Socrates did not teach anybody. He went around Athens talking to people. I'll say more about that later. Plato was one of the people, the young men, that followed Socrates around. Some of what Plato did was write down what Socrates said and who he talked to, but later on, Plato wrote his own stuff. And this dialogue comes from the period of Plato writing his own stuff. So, why dialogue? Plato and others got the idea from listening to Socrates that philosophy needed to be a dialogue, needed to involve two people talking to each other. So they wrote in dialogue because they believed that this was the means of developing philosophical thought, the means of arriving at wisdom. So the dialogue is very important. That there is dialogue is crucial. It's not by accident. It's not just to tell a story or something like that. That there's a story is kind of important too for Plato, but the dialogue is the main thing. So tips on reading Plato. It may be strange to think that some of these need to be said, but Dr. Polanski was reading Plato in a time period, especially in the United States, in U.S. academic philosophy, when there weren't a lot of people reading Plato this way. There were a lot of people reading Plato strictly for the sake of identifying the arguments, the logical series of propositions, and not looking at anything else in the dialogues. So, ignoring everything else. So here's what Polanski told us to do. And I thought he was brilliant about this. I don't think that this was original to him either, but he was a very good teacher of this stuff. First of all, assume that Plato was smart and a deliberate writer. So if there is something that looks like an error, a bad argument, a mistake, don't assume Plato was just dumb. Plato was he was sloppy. No, assume that something else is going on instead. There's a reason for it. Whatever's going on, there's a reason for it. So assume he was smart and that what he's doing is deliberate. After all, writing was a very expensive habit then. Number two, assume that the beginnings of the dialogues are important, not just because they set up the question or the topic that's being discussed, but because of the little dramatic bits of business involved. They're often ignored, those opening bits, if you read a lot of the little introductory paragraphs that often come with the dialogues, the editors will just sort of will even just sort of disparage what the introductory bits say and say, after a little bit of back and forth, niceties, pleasantries that have nothing to do with anything, they get down to business. Well, Polanski told us to examine those. Something's going on there. What? Well, number three, in those dramatic bits of business, what to pay attention for is things like who is there, why they are there, what they're doing there, who they are to each other. That's important in the Meno specifically, as you'll see. Because Plato's readers would know those things. And in ancient Greek society, those things meant a lot. These weren't anonymous persons to one another. as we might normally assume in our society, where we are, as Schutt says, relatively anonymous to one another for the most part, unless we do know each other specifically. In ancient Greek society, you were known to be a certain kind of person. You were known as what you are. Meno, for instance, turns out to be a Thessalian. That matters. Fourth, pay attention to questions, comments, asides that don't fit, that are not part of the overall flow of the discussion, or that are odd in some way. Something is going on. Remember what I said, writing was an expensive habit. For Plato to take the time and the money and the etc. to go into something that doesn't seem like it's part of the main part of the dialogue, he must have had something in mind. The fifth one is the big one. The beginning, the end, and the middle of the dialogue tell us something about how to read the entire dialogue. The beginning, the ending, and the middle. They give us a clue about how to read the entire dialogue. It has a sort of weird inside dopester feeling to it when you talk to people about reading the dialogues this way. I don't care. I'm not in this business to be a Plato scholar, for one thing. It opens up the dialogues in an interesting way. I've read the Meno dozens and dozens of times, and what I've come up with as a reading of the Meno is incredibly satisfying and intriguing to me. People can read the Meno in ways that are really flat and uninteresting, and it's frankly the most common way to read it, and I think it's wrong, and I think it's I don't want to say stupid, but stupid. In my mind, the Meno is not flat at all. I think the Meno is diabolical. I think it's extremely clever. Has many layers, and is hard to work out for being as simple as it seems at first. And that's the thing that really gets me about Plato. Plato is sneaky. On one level, Plato's dialogues should be kind of easy to read. Once you get the idea of it being a dialogue and kind of work that out in your head, that it's a little like reading a play script, that you just have to see that it's back and forth and keep in mind who is saying what, and just get into that rhythm and remember the kind of like reading a play script. Remember that there is a dramatic tension between these two sides, and that matters, and that each is after something, and that matters. They should be easy to read. There's not a lot of technical terminology. They're not throwing terms at you the way Schutz did. They're not depending on complicated definitions or stipulating things typically. Socrates always wants definitions of terms, but not in technical language, just kind of everyday language. One thing that makes the Meno characteristic of a certain period of Plato's work is that it is what's called an aporematic dialogue. That just means it ends in aporia, which is the Greek word for puzzlement. It doesn't come to a conclusion. It ends in perplexity. They don't have an answer. So, The important characters, Socrates, Meno, and Meletus. So say something about Meletus first. It takes place at Meletus's house. Meletus, Plato's readers would know, this dialogue came middle point, we think, in Plato's career, sometime well after Socrates' death. Meletus was one of Socrates' accusers / prosecutors at his trial. In the ancient Greek criminal law system, you had to be accused by a particular person. You weren't accused by the state, like you would be in our criminal justice system. There, an individual person had to try you. So that individual who accused you was also your prosecutor. Meletus was one of the prosecutors at Socrates' trial. Plato's readers would know that. And Meno was a sort of friend of the family. They say a guest friend, which suggests a kind of alliance with Meletus's family. There's a hint of a political connection. And he's from, as I said before, he's from Thessaly. Now, Thessaly was another city-state. So Meno is not from Athens. The culture could have been different. You know that Sparta was a very different culture from Athens. Thessaly was different from Athens. Thessaly was generally friendly with Athens, but a different place. That matters. So, Socrates. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates is sometimes the historical person and sometimes a character that Plato uses the name of Socrates for, which is a little confusing. He kind of, I think, just banks on the name Socrates. In this dialogue, he uses Socrates' name as a character, but a lot of the traits of the historical Socrates are still here. So in the Meno, for instance, the Socrates character doesn't seem very divergent from the historical Socrates. In part, we know this from the allusions to Socrates' trial. There are a couple. These are little, cookies for Plato's readers who would, after all, have known about that. And from Socrates' insistence that he was not teaching, and also from the fact that the dialogue ends in aporia, perplexity. So, Socrates never taught. He never got paid anything. There were itinerant teachers in Athenian society, most of whom were called sophists, which means wise people, basically. Philosopher means a lover of wisdom, in contrast. He spent his time wandering around Athens asking people, prominent people, rich, wealthy people, into politics, mostly, questions about their decisions, their life, their beliefs, and so on. What they think they knew, why they believed they knew it. Mostly this was embarrassing to political muckety-mucks. The reason he did this was a friend of his asked the oracle of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, who was the wisest man in Athens? And the oracle, kind of priest, said, "It's Socrates." Now, as oracles were wont to do, this could have been a puzzle. And Socrates took it as a puzzle. He says this in his trial, which is depicted in Plato's dialogue, The Apology. And Socrates took the puzzle to be, since Socrates knew that he knew nothing, that the puzzle was, if he's wisest, that must mean he should go out and find somebody who knows something. So he went around asking people these questions to find out who really was wise, who really knew something. That's what he said he was doing. Of course they killed him. What choice did they have? He was embarrassing the political muckety-mucks. They tried him for crimes against the Athenian state, including corrupting the youth and violating the Athenian religious laws. They sentenced him to drink hemlock, and he was executed in that way. You know, as you do. So, reading the Meno specifically. So remember, you have to read everything carefully. I suggest read it through, ideally all of it, but at least through the part in the middle where there's suddenly a servant boy and they're talking about geometry, up until you get Meno's reaction to all of that. There's some reaction in the middle of that, but then at the very end, right, the servant boy leaves. The very, very end of all of that servant boy stuff. So at least to that, but ideally the entire dialogue. And then reread very slowly up through that middle part. So that's up to about 88 in the Stephanus numbers. Oh, the numbers in the margin. Those are Stephanus numbers. They're named after Henricus Stephanus, who published an edition of Plato's Dialogues in the 16th century. And so we still use those as a reference number. That's how fast things move in academia. So why read twice? First time through, you're getting a who's who says what are they talking about, where does this go, what are the themes, etc. What happens? Second time through, more carefully, charting it out. What happens? Okay, why does that happen? What happens next? Okay, why does that happen? Something more like I don't advise this, but something more like a close reading, if you know what a close reading is. But don't do a close reading. I think if you try to do a close reading of the Meno, you could go insane. So these are some information-y type themes to look out for. Where does Meno get his information? What does Meno say he wants to know? What does Socrates say about his own knowing? I'll give you this list too. What does Socrates propose they do in order to gain knowledge? And then later on, in the dialogue, Socrates will introduce a distinction that I'm about 87.6% sure is a Platonic one, not a Socratic one. In other words, this is Plato's idea, not Socrates' idea, which is a distinction between knowledge, opinion, and true opinion. But that's in the second half of the dialogue, so we'll not deal with that this week. But just to give you a clue about that theme coming up. So that's how to read the Meno for this week. Am I on?